Republican 2020 election deniers have been nominated to the November ballot for Secretary of State in several states. 7 have won Republican primaries so far, including one in Minnesota on Tuesday. Next week, the former president will host a fundraiser for Michigan's Christina Caramo. She's one of a coalition of Secretary of State candidates running to, quote unquote, fix, that means overturn, the 2020 election. Joining me now to discuss this is State Representative B. Nguyen, the Democratic nominee for Georgia Secretary of State. B, it is great to finally meet you. I feel like I've heard a lot about you and finally get to meet you in person live on the show. I want to start with this. I feel like Secretary of States and this office in 2022 is what district attorneys were in, say, 2018, right? After we saw police violence in Ferguson, people were like, oh, my gosh, this is an important position. We should pay attention to who our county prosecutors are and district attorneys. Now they're recognizing that about Secretary of State. Tell me, in the state of Georgia, what does the Secretary of State actually do? What is your job? Do you run the elections? Do you organize business? What's the responsibility that you're seeking from the voters in Georgia?
Yes, the Secretary of State's office has tremendous responsibilities, and one of the most important things is overseeing our elections in the state of Georgia. And that means having a Secretary of State who is not going to put their thumb on the scale on the front end. So in our history here in Georgia, we've had a Secretary of State under Brian Kemp, who was known for purging hundreds of thousands of Georgians off the rolls, specifically Black voters. And then we see that same tradition being carried on by our current Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. So it's about making sure that we have a Secretary of State who will run free, fair, and efficient elections in all 159 of our counties, resource our local election boards instead of throw them under the bus, and make sure that we're investing in voter education, voter communication, and most importantly, upholding all the tenets of democracy, which is ensuring that every eligible voter in Georgia has access to the ballot box and has access without barriers.
So your opponent, the incumbent Brad Raffensperger, is someone who, certainly I never made the mistake, but someone who was occasionally lauded and praised for having the strength to actually say, oh, I'm not going to throw the election completely for Donald Trump. And he did manage to fight off a challenge from a Trump-backed challenger. My question to you is, what are you going to do specifically that would be different from Brad Raffensperger? How would you try to set up rules or responsibilities or statutes as Secretary of State that would prevent some of the things that we were basically dependent on his integrity to fix when he was in office in 2020?
Well, there's certainly a lot of room to grow as it pertains to what the Secretary of State should be doing and what the current Secretary of State is doing right now. And I think that it goes to show that the Republican Party has gone so far to the right that when an officer who has taken the oath to swear allegiance to our Constitution and to our country simply follows the law, we are met with a reaction of believing that is the bar that should be met. But in fact, we deserve much better. I'm going to give you a very specific example of something that's happening here in Georgia right now. Our Public Service Commission, it is elected by a mechanism called at-large voting for a specific district voting. And there was a lawsuit that was led by a voting rights group, including the NAACP. And a Trump-appointed judge just ruled that the current method that we have in place for public service commissioners, the people who set the rates of our utilities, that is a pocketbook issue. It is violating Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And instead of accepting that ruling, the current Secretary of State is appealing it. And we know it dilutes the power of Black voters. So that is certainly something that I would not have done if I were in this position. I would use it as an opportunity to ensure that there are free and fair elections happening in the state of Georgia.
Now, B, you're running in a very diverse slate. There are only 6 non-white secretaries of state in all of the United States right now. But the top of your ticket is obviously Stacey Abrams, who is challenging Brian Kemp again for governor. You two would have to work very closely together, not only to protect the election in 2024, but local elections and midterm elections and everything else like that. What are some ways that you think that Stacey Abrams presents sort of a better option for Georgia voters, whether that's economics, whether that's voting rights, than the current incumbent Brian Kemp?
Well, we know that Stacey Abrams has been a leader on voting rights in the state of Georgia. And we saw in 2021, after we delivered these wins for the 2 U.S. Senate seats that have been crucial to our success as a country, we know that Republicans went into the legislature and they passed this 98-page voter suppression bill that makes it a crime to hand out a bottle of water to a voter waiting in line, that cripples the ability to vote by mail and takes away secure drop boxes. That was endorsed by both the governor, who signed it into law, and the Secretary of State. And I have to remind voters that that bill was also based on conspiracy theories, based on lies. If we had a governor like Stacey Abrams and a Democratic legislature, a Democratic Secretary of State, we can take steps to repeal those voter suppressive bills on the books. We also know that extreme bills such as that one, they are bad for business. We've seen the fallout of these far-right bills. Just recently, the gun expansions that have been supported by Republicans for a number of years led to the pulling out of a major music festival in Georgia. And the same happened after the passing of that 98-page voter suppression bill, where we lost the All-Star game. So these are economic issues because people do not want to live in a state where the government is restricting fundamental rights.
Georgia State Representative Nguyen, also the Democratic nominee for Secretary of State of Georgia, thank you so much for joining us tonight.